Well, thank you, Bob, for that marvellous introduction, or Dean Joss, as he's now come to be known. He told you of one of my flaws. I've searched for years and years to find the dark side of Bob. I haven't found it yet, but I want you to know I will pay richly if you can give me a story. A little later in my speech, I want to talk about some of my personal lessons of life that might be of passing interest to you. But let me begin my remarks with one of those lessons, one that I think you should never forget. And that is, only ever work for quality people. And never, ever compromise on that. I'm fortunate enough to have been able to execute on that strategy, but as most things in life, you need a bit of luck to do so. And I was exceptionally lucky to have the privilege and the pleasure to work under your Dean, Bob Joss, for 6 exhilarating years. Westpac is today the 9th largest bank in the world by market capitalisation. But it was well and truly on its knees in the early 1990s when Westpac was fortunate enough to lure Bob away from another one of the world's great banks, Wells Fargo. And I think it's fairly safe to suggest that I was Bob's number 2 for most of those 6 years. And we had a lot in common. We both had PhDs in economics and finance from some of the world's great universities. We both took our first jobs in our respective federal treasuries. We both loved solving complex problems. We were both absolute suckers for facts and logic. We both read a lot. We both had very strong work ethics. We were both great supporters of meritocracy, and we were fierce opponents of corporate politics. And we're both tennis tragics. But there the similarities end. For as you'll be aware, Bob is, as we term it in Australia, simply a great bloke. There is no higher compliment an Australian can pay anyone than to term them a great bloke. And everyone who's ever worked with, above or below Bob, will readily attest to that. By contrast, I was a complete pain in the arse to manage. I was overly ambitious. I was opinionated. I was tragically low on empathy. I was openly and overly harsh on what I thought were weak ideas or insufficiently dedicated effort. And I was often wrong, but I was never in doubt. So most people wouldn't have tolerated me. But Bob persevered to subtly, but certainly mentor, manage and coach me, occasionally with some suitably tough love, to a point with his support I was able to succeed him as CEO of Westpac. You don't get much luckier than to have a mentor and a coach and a boss and a friend like Bob Joss. So Bob, my debt to you is incalculable, and I can think of no better place than right here to publicly and humbly thank you for your counsel and your guidance and your wisdom and your friendship in those years and beyond. I'll never forget it, and I'll never take it for granted. To all of you, may you just have a fraction of the luck that I've had in that crucial respect. In the remainder of my remarks today, I intend to cover 3 topics. First, the global financial crisis and policy responses. Secondly, corporate social responsibility and corporate ethics. And thirdly, as alluded to already, some of my lessons of life. A full lecture couldn't do justice to any one of them, so I apologise in advance to seeking to cram 3 such topics into a single session. Inevitably, the coverage will be hopelessly thin, and I apologise in advance for that. First, the GFC. The causes of the crisis were manifold, but included complacency towards risk, built up during an exceptionally long boom stretching over 16 years, reflected in lax lending standards and watered-down risk management. Unrealistically low interest rates and a wall of money seeking enhanced returns, contributing to excessive leverage. Innovation, complexity, opacity of risk in a wide variety of structured credit and other instruments. Investors were removed from the origination process and placed a lot of faith in ratings agencies. These innovations outpaced the capacity of financial institutions and regulators to manage risk. And compensation systems that in many places were not closely linked to long-term profitability and value creation. The conversion of mortgage securities from huge illiquid assets owned by local banks into liquid financial instruments that could be sold across the world combined sophisticated US financial services dangerously with relatively unsophisticated financial services elsewhere. The result of all of the foregoing is a dysfunctional financial system and clogged credit markets in most parts of the world. Probably the epicenter of the GFC was the weekend prior to the collapse of Lehman's and the bailout of AIG. JC Flowers, the private equity firm I now work with, had a rather interesting weekend that weekend. On the Saturday morning, we were trying to buy AIG with Allianz. AIG said they were fine and didn't need equity. On Monday, they went to the Fed for an $85 billion bailout. On the Saturday afternoon, we were negotiating to buy with another party, Lehman Brothers. Their chairman told us to go packing. Lehman was, of course, bankrupt by the following Monday. We then spent Sunday as advisors of the Bank of America on their Merrill Lynch purchase, which had to be consummated before the opening of Asian markets on Monday morning. It was quite a weekend. What are the implications of the GFC for the global economic outlook? Plainly, we nearly lost the global banking system in September and October of 2008. That was a massive and very public shock. Collapse or near collapse of what was supposed to be some of our safest institutions. Deleveraging is now sweeping the world, or more precisely, private sector deleveraging. In response, the public sector is leveraging up massively. But a vicious circle is underway. Credit rationing is hurting the real economy. This is causing more bad debts, in turn further impairing banks' willingness to lend. Hence, world growth is now projected to fall in 2009 to its lowest rate since World War II. While recovery is forecast to begin in 2010, it is impossible to forecast ahead by more than 12 months with any degree of certainty. This deep global response is despite very wide-ranging policy actions by governments in the past 6 to 9 months. The private sector deleveraging process currently underway is necessary, but needs to be less disorderly. It remains to be seen whether the liquidity provisioning, the capital injections, and the measures to address and dispose of problem assets are enough to ensure sufficient balance sheet cleansing and the restoration of confidence in the long-term solvency of our major financial institutions. History indicates that credit growth remains sluggish until banks' balance sheets are cleansed. So in summary, regarding the global outlook, we will not have another Great Depression. We have learnt the policy lessons from that mistake. But the balance of probabilities is that the global economy is almost certainly set for the worst recession in the post-World War II period. Let me talk about the regulatory response. Governments in most of the world at present have an involvement in their financial systems that is very extensive. Moreover, governments around the world are claiming that the shortcomings in the systems of financial regulation were a, if not the significant contributor to the GFC, and that radical regulatory reform is required. Let me deal first with the interventions themselves. I have no quarrel with the interventions to date, especially those in late 2008. We nearly had a meltdown of the global banking system. In those circumstances, action was extraordinarily urgent and needed to err on the side of doing too much rather than too little. These measures avoided the very real possibility of systemic collapse, an outcome too horrible to contemplate. But we are now past that cataclysmic point. These measures now need to be kept under constant review, and this is important for two reasons. First, to remove the distortions and the unintended consequences of measures that had to be devised and implemented urgently in a crisis atmosphere. And secondly, to reduce the imposition of significant non-commercial objectives onto the banking system by our political system. We're already seeing just how extensive these non-commercial objectives are in countries where governments have become very heavily involved in their domestic banking systems, notably in the UK, but also to an extent here in the US, including executive compensation caps, required exclusive or near exclusive focus on activity in the domestic market, and home mortgage foreclosure forbearance. Moreover, we should not believe that we have seen the end of this involvement, especially given the real possibility of full or partial nationalisation of banking systems in several countries. It's understandable that there's some public sympathy for such measures. Indeed, that's precisely what the politicians are responding to, as literally billions of taxpayer dollars have been thrown at this carnage. Moreover, there's a lot of superficial appeal in the argument that public sector ownership and management could scarcely do any worse than the private sector counterparts they're replacing. But ongoing pursuit and entrenchment of these non-commercial objectives in this manner will take us a long way back to the extreme bank regulation of the 1980s and earlier. I repeat, the argument in favour of re-regulation is beguilingly simple. Banking was progressively and significantly deregulated over the past 20 to 25 years. The banking industry, so the argument goes, has used those additional freedoms recklessly. Moreover, the tab for that mismanagement is being worn by the general taxpayer. Hence, so the argument runs, deregulation has been a failure and bank regulation needs to be drastically strengthened and reimposed. The basic case for regulation is that financiers make mistakes and frequently everyone else, mainly taxpayers, has to pay for them. Moreover, finance feeds on trust and mistrust and amplifies whatever is ascendant. And this is what makes financial markets dangerous. Some regulatory reform is undoubtedly required. First, if something needs rescuing, it's a sign that it needs regulating. If a hedge fund, such as long-term credit management, or an investment bank such as Lehman's, or an insurance company such as AIG looks large enough to threaten the system, there's a prima facie case for it to be supervised. Regulators need to be charged with protecting the financial stability of the financial sector as a whole. And by that test, after the past year, the net of prudential regulation needs widening. This raises the broader question of regulation's failure to evolve with the shadow banking system. Private equity, hedge funds, money market funds, welcome, you haven't missed much. Non-banks like GE Capital and new securities such as CDOs and credit default swaps. On the eve of the crash, more money was flowing through this than the conventional banking system. But remember that one of the reasons that these organisations grew up was to avoid the cost of regulation. And wherever we draw the new circle, it is certain that new entities will be designed to sit just outside it. Secondly, we do need measures that will help reduce the notorious pro-cyclical bias of financial markets in general, and specifically of banks. Restoring dynamic provisioning for credit risk is an urgent and helpful first step. Thirdly, monetary policy needs to be guided by more than a single figure for inflation and needs to look more broadly at the build-up of unsustainable imbalances. Beyond these measures, however, the case for further regulation remains to be proven. In that regard, it needs to be remembered there's no such thing as a perfect market other than in undergraduate textbooks. All markets have varying degrees of imperfection. Because from time to time markets perform in a particularly suboptimal fashion, that is not a sufficient condition to prove that public ownership or extensive public regulation is the right solution. We need to remember that public ownership, intervention and regulation are also imperfect, indeed highly imperfect devices. We need to remember the lessons of heavy regulation. It comes at a heavy cost, especially in terms of lack of innovation. It results in an undoubtedly safe but extremely stodgy banking system, uncompetitive, undynamic, uninnovative. and the intended effects of deregulation, are usually avoided by the more nimble, often with counterproductive effects. Secondly, regulation can be, at very best, a third line of defence behind management and behind boards. Regulators have generally been painfully slow to see the difficulties banking systems were getting themselves into, even slower than the respective boards and management. Corporate governance reform is, in my judgment, a more pressing priority. The board structures in many of these countries have been found severely wanting. I understand in the US it's still not uncommon for the CEO and the chairman to be the same person, although Bob tells me on the way over that's just changed at Bank of America this morning. It's also not unknown for board members in many countries to be cheerleaders of the CEO. Bob and I had no such luck at Westpac. In other cases, boards are chaired by people with no knowledge of financial services, surrounded by other great and good friends of the chairman. Plainly, we need to have people on these boards who understand the financial industry and are available frequently. This is especially true of the Risk Committee, which needs to meet frequently, be semi-professional, and be capable of delivering opinions aligned to the interests of shareholders. Plainly, we will need to pay more for this expertise, and I'm not sure everybody is ready to do so. Third, and this is a very hard thing to say when you're CEO running a major bank being run by a regulator, but the fact is that regulatory agencies everywhere have lost out, and lost out badly, in the war for talent. Agencies are staffed by people, to generalise, are worse paid, worse qualified, and generally less experienced than those they are seeking to regulate. And the gap is getting wider. One consequence is that talented people in the private financial sector, combined with the fungibility of money and the globalisation of financial markets, combine to produce a formidable capacity to circumvent much well-intentioned regulation. So let me try and draw together my main conclusions regarding the GFC and the global economic outlook. First, we need to have some humility in attempting to forecast how the GFC will play out over the period ahead, because the stark fact is no one knows. However, I do expect the global recession to be the worst in the post-war period, but nothing approaching a depression. The speed with which confidence and sentiment turn is paramount. Secondly, I believe there is a very significant threat around excessive government intervention in financial systems, but I believe that risk to be manageable. Secondly, let me talk a little about corporate social responsibility and corporate ethics. It was an issue that we embraced fully and enthusiastically at Westpac. Westpac was adjudged the leading bank in the world for sustainability, as judged by the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, for 6 of the 7 years from 2000 to 2007. The Ethisphere Institute has just released its 2009 list of 100 companies it considers to be the most ethical groups around the globe. Westpac was the only Australian company selected. Other companies included Honeywell, Nike, Unilever, General Mills and BMW. Westpac was on the 2008 list as well. We pursued this course of corporate social responsibility and ethical behaviour vigorously for 2 disarmingly simple reasons. First, it was the right thing to do. Secondly, it was good for business. We didn't set out to win awards, but what we did was to lift the corporate veil and seeing the underlying dimensions of today's modern corporation. The economic engine that they constitute, and the social system of shareholders, employees and customers. Because when we talk about meeting the needs of the corporation, we are really talking about meeting the needs both of the economic machine and of the social system that is inseparable from it. That is why managing broad, in the interests of our people and our customers, and contributing to community building, is so vitally important. In our case, this was at the very core of our service profit chain business model, which linked engaged employees to satisfied customers to value-adding outcomes for shareholders. This is where we meet the logic of managing ethically. Being a social system that is part of larger society creates an imperative to operate our businesses in line with societal expectations, to operate our businesses in a responsible, ethical and trustworthy manner. And being so pervasive as Westpac was, Australia's first company, founded in 1817, 6.5 million customers, 27,000 employees, hundreds of thousands of shareholders, meeting our own needs as a business simply merged into meeting the needs of the community. Just as critically, our employees didn't leave their values at the door when they came to work. On the contrary, they wanted to work with a company with a decent set of values, values that aligned with their own. It is a total fallacy to think that you can today micromanage individuals and determine the way that they think, especially our younger generation. It is strong corporate values that are the glue that knits together the company's social system and the economic machine. This plan of ours was strategic. It was strategic in terms of managing our regulatory and reputational risk, managing our social contract, if you like, creating value-adding opportunities by understanding the emerging socio-political environment and trends better than others, and driving that through meeting the broader needs of our people and our customers. Winning the trust of our people was fundamental to our success. Trust that you care about them, that you'll listen to them, that it's safe to speak up, that you care about what they think and value and believe. Engendering a direct high-trust relationship with our people was, I think, perhaps the company's most significant and valuable achievement. Why is that valuable? It's valuable because such employees are more efficient and they're more productive. From them you draw more discretionary effort. Employees who enjoy coming to work more effectively than employees who don't. If they like their work, if they're rewarded on merit regardless of gender, race or ethnicity, if the company's values align with their own, if they're proud of the company that they work for, they'll work harder, they will essentially manage themselves, and they stay longer with the company. And for the company, these are huge advantages. So we set about building a trustworthy, responsible and ethical organisation, values that simultaneously met the needs of our organisation and the people that we wished to attract and retain. And that objective was at the heart of our corporate responsibility and sustainability program. There is, of course, another great benefit in all of this, because in our business, employees are literally inseparable from customers, because to our customers, our employees were the bank. Because customers don't trust companies, they trust people. The underpinnings of a successful brand in our business is most often a matter of the human connection. It's only humans who have passion. It's only humans who have integrity. And our customers judge the credibility of our brand in large part by the values of our people. There is a very direct correlation between loyal employees and loyal customers, and it's in that correlation that shareholder value substantially lies. Bob said to me during a visit of his to Australia that what most impressed him about Westpac in 2007 was the respect in which it was held. And I believe that was in part about being a company in tune with the needs and the spirit of the present age. I can see some eye glazing in the audience, which is naturally at this stage of the speech, and saying, did any of this add to shareholder value? Well, we can't prove that, but when Bob and I first joined Westpac, it was a seriously lagging number 4 of the big 4 banks in Australia. It lay well outside of the world's top 50 banks by market capitalisation, and its profitability was poor. By 2008, Westpac was the number 1 bank in Australia by market capitalisation and the number 2 company overall in Australia. It was, as I've mentioned, the 9th largest bank in the world by market capitalisation, and in the most reputable annual survey of global banking from Oliver Wyman, it was judged in 2008 the most profitable large-cap bank in the world as measured by return on equity. Ethics and corporate responsibility is good for business, as well as being the right thing to do. Let me now turn to my third and final section of my address today. And I'd like to show you a few clips of my acting career. It's okay, just joking. I've reached that stage in my career where one's perhaps entitled to look back and reflect on some lessons of life. And my main message to you is that you live your life the way you want to live it and not for anyone else. To make your own choices, not live somebody else's hopes and dreams. Enjoy the terrific daring adventure that now stretches before you with all the hope and the optimism and the energy and the enthusiasm that you're obviously feeling today listening to this lecture. But most of all, make it your own. Trust me, that's actually not as easy as it sounds. In fact, it's not easy at all. It certainly wasn't for me, at least. It took me the best part of a quarter century to understand this and to make my life my own. I hope that in explaining briefly how and why, in my case, it will help you achieve this goal much more quickly than I managed. My journey involved 5 pivotal experiences, out of which flowed 5 priceless lessons, which would have changed my life irrevocably. My first lesson was with adversity comes priceless opportunities. When I was 10 years old, adversity entered our home in one fell swoop. My mother left home, my father went bankrupt, the bank sold our house, and I had to leave the school I attended. That experience taught me some difficult but extraordinarily valuable truths. That everything changes and ends, that things don't always go according to plan, life isn't always fair, pain is a part of life, and people aren't always there to support you when you need them. But learning these truths early on helped me cope with life more effectively. I was better equipped to handle disappointments because I felt I'd already been through a few serious ones. The second thing the crisis did for me was to tip me out of a third-rate private school into a first-rate selective government high school, Melbourne High School. And it was there that I met one of the most important mentors in my life, Neville Drowan, an economics master and later principal of the school, who taught me a love of economics and commerce that has stayed with me all my life. And when I had to leave for financial reasons, secondary school prematurely at the age of 16, it was again Neville who helped me finish my last years of secondary school by correspondence while I was working full-time. Perhaps most importantly, this childhood trauma forged in me a steely determination and drive that would stay with me all my life. I was absolutely determined to work incredibly hard to overcome that terrible feeling of not being able to pay the rent or having to cross the street to avoid the butcher because we couldn't afford to pay the weekly meat bill. Why do I relate all this? It's to say that you don't despair when things go wrong, because out of adversity does come priceless opportunities. Opportunities to make your own choices, choices that determine not only what you're going to do with your life, but how you're going to do it. My second lesson was that talent is necessary, but not always sufficient. As I mentioned, I had to leave secondary school prematurely, and for the next 3 years, I attempted to become an actor. It was my first career, and I failed. Failed very spectacularly. And that was hard because I really loved the idea of acting. and obviously launched Olivia Newton-John's career. One thing that I learned was that talent is necessary, but it's not always sufficient. I saw so many much more highly talented actors than me who were unemployed for very long periods of time. And what they needed was some luck. And so much of life is about being in the right place at the right time. And why is this important? Because you have to realize that sometimes things happen that are simply outside your control. You can't always make things happen. So you learn to change what you can and accept what you can't change. And you don't beat yourself up to say that you're not good enough. You make a choice to accept that this time it didn't work out, but there's a whole other ocean of opportunities out there to pursue. So the important thing is to stay optimistic and keep searching. Often we're told to go after what we love. But in some ways that's bad advice. Because in my judgment, you have to find not only what you love, but also what you're good at. I loved acting, but by the age of 19, I knew I wasn't any good at it. So at 20, I finally made it to university. I was older than most other students, but I knew firsthand that life without secondary schooling and tertiary education was going to be very tough indeed. So I was incredibly motivated to really make the most of university, and I was probably equipped with life skills learned through 3 years in the workforce than those who just drifted into it. Academic life led me to my third pivotal lesson, and that is, don't let fear of failure hold you back, but rather use it to drive yourself. Do your best and back yourself, and you will almost certainly surprise yourself in a very positive manner. Let me illustrate. I'd won a scholarship to the London School of Economics to begin the Master of Economics program. And from the start, I was coming from behind because I arrived a full month late and missed out on the intensive maths and stats courses essential for the rest of the master's program. Why did I arrive late? I'd been playing professional football in Canberra and we made the grand final. But winning that game came at a very big price. I'd lost the first month of study and I really thought I was going to fail my master's. Because you need to understand that fear of failure had long been a part of my life. But once again, I used that fear to fuel a huge burst of hard work to get on top of my studies. And at the end of my master's exams, I went straight to work for the International Monetary Fund on 19th Street in Washington, D.C. And I very nervously took a call from my professor at the London School of Economics to tell me of my master's result. And I remember it like it was yesterday, feeling so afraid that I'd failed my master's. And my professor, in his inimitable, very stuffy, British understated way, told me, "You've done tolerably well." So, thanks, Professor Prest. Any more? He said, "You've passed." In fact, so the long silence, he said, "In fact, you managed a high distinction in your special subject." Another silence. "In fact, you also managed a high distinction in all the other subjects." "Oh, and you also won the medal for top student." "Oh, and it was also by a margin managed by only one other person in the entire history of the course." Said almost as an afterthought. Even now, I can't truly express what that meant to me. I'd proved myself to myself on the world stage. It was a turning point for me in terms of self-confidence. It taught me that I was capable of doing some serious things with my life. Indeed, that I had to do something with this world-class education and this newfound confidence. There's a fourth lesson in my life that I'd like to share with you today, and that is that while you can't have everything you want in life, you can have any one thing that you want. And that means that sometimes you need to make some tough choices. So my message to you today is that before you lies a daring adventure, and you'll have a lifetime of interesting opportunities and many choices, perhaps more than any other generation. Have the confidence to make those choices your own and to live the life the way you want to live it. For me, it meant choosing between a professional football career and a scholarship at the London School of Economics. It was a choice I never regretted, because even though I love football, I wanted a world-class postgraduate education even more. My fifth and final lesson is that life is precious and very, very short. So don't postpone looking for happiness. I've talked a lot about pivotal moments and the importance of making the choices that are right for you. But the last point I touch on is the most important of all. In your search for success, don't forget to look for happiness. And don't take anything for granted, because life is precious and every day counts. This was brought home to me not too long ago when my two best friends died within a short period of each other. They were both the godfather, successively, of my daughter, and were both brilliant men in the prime of their lives and very distinguished careers. Soon after, my wife, Ros, was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was a terrible time for our family, and quite honestly, nothing else mattered at the time but her health. Fortunately, they caught it early, and she recovered and enjoys good health today. But it absolutely brought home to me the preciousness of life, the fact that it can be very short, and you shouldn't postpone enjoyment of life or your happiness. And we need to keep reminding ourselves of that every single day. So step confidently forward to live life on your own terms, to know your inner selves and use your strengths and your values as your moral compass to chart your own course. Because life is a wonderful, daring adventure to be enjoyed with great happiness. And whatever you do, make it your own. Thank you.